I'm very pleased to be back for a new tutorial. With Infinity War out on Blu-ray and everybody wondering how that end credit sting from Ant-Man and the Wasp is going to play out in Avengers 4, we decided to return to the MCU for today's tutorial.
Hi, Simon Jones here. So as you've guessed by now, this week we're covering the Ant-Man shrinking effect. Let's break it apart to see what it's made of. First we have the shot of me in front of a green screen, having caught the shrinking device. I indulge in some hokey, "Oh my god, I'm shrinking" acting, while the camera makes a couple of very strategic moves. Let's check that out again. First the camera rises up and tilts down slightly as I begin my flailing, then the camera returns back to a waist-high position, and finally the camera lowers down to the floor while I also lower myself to the floor. I'm 37, this is not a simple thing to do. I hope you appreciate the effort we all go to bring you these tutorials. In isolation, this green screen shot looks very peculiar. The camera move and my timed movements are in fact designed to mimic the perspective shift as I fall, shrinking, before hitting the floor with a thud and getting back to my tiny feet. This basically avoids having to suspend me or your actor on a fancy wire rig while pulling off a really complex camera move, which most of us unfortunately don't have the budget for. Once the shot is keyed and the green screen removed, it starts to make a bit more sense. Separated from the original background, the camera move and my physical actions combine to create the illusion of perspective shift, as if I'm moving around in freefall. The addition of the background plate gives a completely different context to my movements. The camera move here has major perspective shift going on throughout. There are all sorts of different approaches to handling this, depending somewhat on what tools you have available and the specifics of the shot you're trying to pull off. Although you could go with a fully 3D solution, I wanted to keep the shot within the grasp of HitFilm Express users, so the shot is actually 2D all the way through, albeit with a few 3D particle effects thrown in. At the beginning of the shot, the green screen layer is tracked onto the floor, but once the shrinking begins, it turns into an animated layer, which is designed to match the movement of the handheld camera, before then settling back into the landing when I'm tracked back onto the floor again. On top of this, we have a particle simulator generating the trails, and another particle simulator providing some atmospheric dust particles once we're down on the floor. We do have a project file to download with some clips so that you can follow along and give this shot a go yourself. Check the link down in the notes. I'm not going to go into the keying of the green screen element in much detail because there are literally a million billion tutorials about that kind of stuff. One quick detail I will point out though is that we had to shoot this green screen shot handheld because it was the only way to get the kind of camera move and perspective shift that we needed, especially the bit right at the end where we lower down to the floor. As such, it has handheld wobble to it. This makes compositing it into another handheld shot potentially a little bit tricky. So before keying out the green screen, I tracked and stabilised the shot. This meant that after keying, I had a rock-solid, stable green screen layer to composite into the background, as if I'd shot it on a tripod, but still retaining all of that camera movement. Alright, first up, let's have a look at how I tracked the shot. I created multiple tracks for different parts of the running time. To begin with, I opened up the track section of the background layer and clicked the small plus symbol to add a new track. The FX Home offices are conveniently decorated with a carpet, which is perfectly trackable. If you film your own version of this shot, do pay attention to what you can track off the floor. I switched to 2-point tracking because I needed to be able to track rotation as well as position. I also changed to template match mode because it worked a lot better for this kind of texture. I knew where I wanted to be standing in the shot, so I positioned my tracking markers nearby. Specifically, I targeted the corners of some of the carpet patterns. I then hit the track forward button and left HitFilm to do its thing. Fast forwarding a bit, once we're into the camera move, I stopped the tracking, as this track was only for the first part of the shot where I needed to be tracked solidly onto the floor. I created a new point layer to hold the tracking data using the new layer menu, And then up in the tracking panel, I applied the tracking data onto that new point, making sure to check the rotation option as well. I'll rename the point to Floor Track Start, just so I can keep track of what's going on the timeline. Switching back to the viewer panel, I can now take my keyed green screen shot and put it in place. In the parenting menu, I can select the new point, which will lock the green screen layer onto that tracked point. If I now scrub through the timeline, you can see that my feet stay where they're supposed to. Next up was the animation of me shrinking down. During the shrinking, I didn't want the green screen layer to still be parented to the tracked floor. The simple way to do this is to use the slice tool to cut the layer at the appropriate point. I created a brand new point layer, called it Animation, then switched the parenting from the second part of the green screen layer over to that. So on that frame, as the shrinking animation begins, I stop being parented to the floor and instead become parented to this new animation point. Viewers, of course, will have no idea about that switch around. I'm using a separate point layer for the animation because it gives me a bit more freedom about how I arrange the shot, as I'll demonstrate a bit later. So the animation involved rapidly scaling down the layer and having it appear to fly up in the air before then dropping back down and hitting the floor. I put in some basic keyframes to start with and then continually tweaked the movement to get what I wanted. Remember, I'm doing this keyframing to the animation point layer, not directly to the green screen layer. A lot of this is trial and error and will depend on the kind of animation you're going for and how experienced you are as an animator. For the shot, I used the value graph, which is really useful for this kind of shot. You can access the graph by clicking this button on the timeline. If you've never used it before, it can be a little intimidating on first glance. The way it works is that whatever property you have selected on the left will be displayed on the graph on the right. So if I select Scale for this layer, you can see the scale graph. This shows how the scale value is shifting over time, and you can then go in to adjust the animation curves to change the speed and values. Basically, a steeper line means that there's a more rapid change happening from one value to another. For this shot, I wanted the initial shrinking over the first second or two to be very rapid, so I was able to adjust the graph to have a sharp, steep curve at the beginning, which then slows down and stabilizes out somewhat. If this is your first time using the value graph, it's well worth taking the time to get more familiar with it, as it will make a huge difference to making more natural animations and will come in handy in all kinds of ways. It's one of those features that you might not even have realized was actually there, so do remember it from now on. One thing I realized is that the timing on the green screen shot wasn't quite right. I needed to get to the landing part faster. This is actually pretty simple to do. I can use the editing tools to slice, remove and retime the clip to get it to do what I want when I want it. The useful bit is that because I'm using that animation point layer to do all of the transformation stuff, I can fiddle around with these layers without messing up any of my animation keyframes, because they're all safely stored on the point layer. So now on to the third part of the shot, once I've thudded into the floor. At this point we need to return to the track being absolutely rock solid. Starting around the time of the landing, I tracked the floor again, making sure to track near the spot where I was going to hit. You want to do the tracking near to where the object is going to be, so that you don't end up with any accidental perspective drift. I applied this track to a new point called Floor Track End. This means that at the moment I hit the floor, the accurate tracking kicks back in, locking me in place. This is all complicated somewhat because the camera move is still happening. At the point of landing, I'm still very small in the shot, but by the end of it, I'm back to being relatively much bigger in the frame. This required more keyframe animation, carefully matching the speed of the camera move to the value graph curve of the scale property. Like I said, as with any animation, there's always a significant period of adjustment and tweaking and finessing, depending really on how skilled you are as an animator. And I should point out I'm not an animator, so this took me a fair old time to get right. So skipping forward a little bit, I ended up with something like this. Of course, the other significant part of the shot is the trail of after images that emanate from my body as I shrink down. This took a bit of figuring out, but here's what I ended up doing. First, I added a particle simulator to the shot. In its emitter settings, I attached the shape to the animated green screen layer. As you can see, this means that the emitter now follows me around as I shrink. Remember, the way I've built this shot is not 3D. There's no fully tracked 3D camera move going on here. That means that the particle simulator has no automatic understanding of what's going on in the shot. To get around this, I switched the emitter trajectory to target mode. This means that all new particles are directed towards a point in space. I then set this target to be behind the camera and off to the left slightly. In the particle system settings, I ramped up the speed really high to about 4000. This results in the particles being fired off past the camera's point of view. During the main part of the camera move, this required some subtle animation of the emitter target to ensure that the particles were always being fired out in the correct direction relative to the camera's current position. This required going back and forth on the timeline and adjusting the target position to achieve the right look, but it creates the impression of a 3D camera passing through the particles, even though the virtual camera never actually moves. In fact, I never even bothered adding a 3D camera to the scene. Like I say, depending on what exactly you're doing with your shot will depend on how far you have to go into this kind of thing, and for some shots it might actually be simpler to go the full 3D camera solve route. So currently we're just firing off white dots, and it looks, well, a little bit weird, let's say. We need to change this to be using a texture that looks like a freeze frame of me. For this I found the composite shot containing the green screen layer over in the media panel, and then from its menu I chose Make Composite Shot. I'll call this new composite shot Trails. This creates a new comp with that keyed layer already inside. As a tip, it's a good idea to use the pre-render option judiciously when working on shots with lots of nested composite shots like this. I've pre-rendered the keyed shot, which speeds everything up considerably as HitFilm isn't having to process the key on every single frame. So onto the keyed layer here, I applied a stutter effect. I set the frame start to 0 so it kicks in straight away, and the freeze frame setting to 20. This means that the clip freezes for 20 frames at a time, before then updating to the next current frame. This provides me with the freeze frames I need for the particle simulation without having to go through and manually export loads of different textures. To get the right look, I added a Find Edges effect, inverted it, and then also added the Threshold effect. I tweaked the threshold until I'd picked out a good amount of detail in the image. Because no individual particle will be on screen for very long, this will give the impression of the particles being after images of the shrinking process, just like in the Ant-Man film. So back in the main composite shot, I can now drop in that Trails comp. I'll switch off its visibility as we don't want to actually see it. It's just there so that it can be referenced by the particle simulator. And then let's dig into the particle system's appearance settings, where I'll switch the texture source to layer, then choose Trails as the source. I'll change the frame setting to animated, with the start frame at 0. I put the number of frames up to 200, as I want it to use all of the available frames that are inside that Trails comp. Make sure billboarding is turned off for this kind of effect, as we want the layers to be able to shift angle depending on where they're going, rather than always facing towards camera. As with quite a few parts of this shot, it took a bit of massaging to get the exact look I was after, so I'm going to skip forward a bit to when I've made a bit more progress. I've set the particle simulator layer to screen blend so that we're getting the right look when it's composited onto the background. By this point, I've set up the particle layer to only start emitting at the right point in the shot. At the first point where the particles appeared, I tweaked the emitter's position and scale so that the particle lined up with the green screen layer. The next thing was to keyframe the scale of the particle system throughout the shot. Now, when you keyframe any properties inside a particle system, they only affect newly spawned particles. These settings represent the state of each new particle at that point in time on the timeline. So if you introduce keyframing and change the settings over time, it'll affect particles that are generated later in the shot. I was able to use this to shrink down the particles over time. I stepped through the shot, adding keyframes for each new particle that appeared, and then changed the particle's scale to match my size at that point in the animation. How many particles to spawn per second took some wrangling. In the end, I ended up keyframing the value so that it starts off at 80 particles per second, and then rapidly drops off. This creates intense visuals at the start of the shot, which then calm down before I hit the floor. Tweaking this setting can dramatically change the kind of look you end up with. Next up is to tweak some of the lifetime properties. Lifetime affects what particles do after they've spawned. For this I set the alpha to a gradient, so that particles fade in quickly, stick around for a bit, and then fade out again. I also set up quite a steep scale ramp, so that over their lifetime particles increase to 300% their original size. This really enhances the sense that the particles are whipping past the camera and are bursting away from the shrinking process. This is still not looking quite right, so some further processing is needed. First up, don't forget to turn on motion blur for the particle simulator, very important when they're moving this quickly. I'm going to turn on motion blur for the green screen layers while I'm at it too. I'm going to add some more effects to the particle simulator to get it closer to the look I'm after. First up, some curves, because we've not used curves yet. I did a pretty crazy RGB curve to pick out particular detail in the particles. You'd never do this kind of curve in normal kind of grading, but for this it was really useful. I also dropped the blue out a bit, introducing more orange into the particles. Probably the most important addition is a zoom blur. I ramped this up pretty high to over 30, and then also set the center point to the green screen layer's position. This means that the zoom is always being pushed out from my position. There's a certain fuzziness to the way you approach creating this kind of shot, where you have to use your own intuition to get what you're after. There are lots of different ways you could animate it, lots of different ways you could design the particle system. If you do have a go at this shot, even if you're using the sample footage, don't stress too much about making it look exactly like the version I did. This isn't that kind of shot, it's not a science really, and that's why I haven't always stated exactly what precise values I've used. You can dig into the project file if you want, of course, but a lot of this stuff is a matter of taste, and in fact, you guys will probably come up with a much better version than what I've done here. At the very end of the shot, once I'm all tiny and we're down on the carpet, I wanted to enhance the feeling of being small. For that I added another particle simulator, which kicks in at the end. I set this up with some floaty dust particles, fairly subtle, but it enhances the impression of being down at ant level. The final element was to add a shadow. In an ideal world I'd be able to retain some of the shadow from the key, but that wasn't possible in this case. Instead I went with a simple hand-drawn shadow, animated to match my movements. Not something you'd want to have to do for a whole movie, but not a problem for a quick shot like this. It's simply a black plane masked out to the appropriate shape and animated accordingly. Once I was happy with the shot, I then made an entirely new composite shot with it inside. Again, this was done by finding the shot in the media panel and choosing Make Composite Shot. This was where I was going to do my final grade. First up, I created a grade layer and applied the Action Cam Lens Distort effect. I keyframed the FOV to shift from 0 to 40 as the camera move begins, so that by the time we're down on the floor there's a definite fisheye curve to the shot. Much like the dust particles, this helps to subtly give the impression of being at a different scale, even though of course we actually shot this with a completely normal camera and didn't actually go particularly small. I then added another grade layer for the final grade. For this I used a curves effect to actually reduce the overall contrast and saturation so that I could then apply a LUT without it becoming too extreme. I used a free LUT called Clouseau. This isn't really the intended use for LUTs, of course, as we've discussed in other tutorials, but is often a good way to get an instantly good look for your video. We'll include a link to the site where I got the LUTs from in the video notes, but generally if you search for free LUT downloads you'll find something interesting. I applied some letterboxing to give the shot a 2:35:1 ratio. This was primarily to cover up some of the edge of frame gaps caused by the stabilization processes I'd used. This was a little bit disappointing actually, because I would have liked to match the 185:1 ratio of the Ant-Man films, but you can't have everything. They had considerably more resources than us. And that about wraps it up, so I really hope this was useful. Thank you very much for watching everyone, it was really fun to be back. I can't wait to see what you all come up with. That's all from me, until next time, don't fall down a time vortex.